So here's what we're working with. Banana for scale. Nice. So the first step here is actually getting a path for the wires to go all the way down to the base so we can power the LEDs inside. So I'm going to start the hole with the pin vise and then put the pin vise in the drill so I can get all the way up into that hip joint there. That's where all my wires are going to meet to come down and hook itself up to the battery. Going slow and as straight as you can is definitely important, and keeping the drill mostly in the chuck until you get to the end stage also helps not snap the drill. That'll bring us to the base. Now, normally I've been using an actual battery holder to hold my little button cell batteries, but this is only a 25mm base, and most of the battery holders that I've found don't really fit a battery in there. So I've actually come up with a better solution for the battery. So I'm going to use this little CR1220 lithium battery. This is a nice 3-volt battery. Most of the little lithium batteries are, but this will have enough voltage to run all of my LEDs. And those little bits on the desk here are spring pins. So I'm going to take a piece of plastic card and snip it down and drill a hole through it so I can glue these spring pins into it. The spring pins is where I'm going to solder a wire to be able to go into the model to actually light it up. And these spring pins will have a good contact to the battery to actually get the electricity to the LEDs. So here's the setup I'm going with. I have a little piece of plastic card here with a hole drilled in it that the spring pin will just fit through. That way I can solder onto it and then push it through so I don't melt the plastic while I'm soldering. And it has a little bit of give at the pin there, hence the spring pin, and that's going to give me a little leeway for the battery. And how are we going to get these batteries to stay in place? Magnets. The lithium batteries are steel cased and are already magnetic, so that part is already taken care of for me. So all I have to do is put some magnets on top that'll hold this in place and push it into the spring pins to give me a good connection. The added benefit to this is I'm not stuck to one specific type of battery. As long as it's thin and small enough to fit, I can use it. So I've drilled a hole in the top for the other connector, and I've actually glued a magnet on here. These magnets are big enough to be able to pull the battery into place through the plastic, which is super cool. Now, these batteries on the bottom are negative and on the top is positive, but that top also wraps around to the side. So I'm going to have a pin that hits the side for my positive and straight down the middle for the negative. So the spring pin for the top didn't actually work the way I was hoping it would. The magnet doesn't have enough force to actually compress the spring, so it was actually pushing it out. So I clipped the spring pin off and I pushed some solder in to just make a little solder joint, little solder ball for the connection point. This is actually working pretty well. What wasn't working well was the alignment of the battery. It was pulling too far off to the side, so I added a little rail in there with plastic card, which got it kind of on line, but it was still kind of poking up like this. So I ended up adding a second magnet. And with this second magnet in place, the battery's holding just fine. I really like having the two magnets now because I have one magnet to kind of hold down one side, and the other magnet is kind of pulling it into the side pin, so I ended up getting a nice solid connection on both of them. And that'll bring us to everyone's favorite time, microscope time. So this is a little arm with the control panel piece here, and I've drilled a hole for the wires and kind of chiseled out an area for an 0603 green LED. So we're going to put that in through that hole, and I've actually drilled the helmet out so the wire is going to kind of snake in through the arm and then come out through the helmet. And then from there, I'm going to find a way to get that into the body where it can hang out with the other wires, so I end up with only having two wires coming down through the leg. So this wire is really thin. It's 36 wire gauge, or about 0.127 millimeters thick. So it's really bendy and it's really thin, and it's pretty difficult to actually fish through these little holes here. But because it is so thin, it will allow this LED to sit really flat within this arm and it won't kind of bulge out. Now, the big question is, how do you keep this in place? Well, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to put some epoxy resin on top of this. I went ahead and dyed this with a little bit of blue alcohol dye, and that way the whole thing will glow the same color and kind of diffuse the light into this actual panel here. So I went ahead and drilled the head out, put a red LED in there, and drilled the eye out and put a little piece of fiber optic cable in there. That'll give you a little bit of a more pulled forward light so it doesn't look like you're looking into something, but it's actually shining from the outside point of his little optic there. Now what I'm doing here is I'm soldering in the resistors so they'll actually live in the body cavity here. So both of these resistors are 0805 sized resistors, and both are around 200 ohms. I wanted to have both of these lights be a little bit underdriven so it wasn't too overpowering, and the LEDs last really long. That way I don't have to throw the model away, because there's really no way that I'm going to go in there and replace these. I've tied both of the negative leads here together for both the arm and the head. I'm going to do the same with the positive leads. I put the resistor on the positive side for both of those. I'm also going to go in here with some epoxy resin. Before I close this guy up, I'm going to put some epoxy resin over all of these wires just to make sure they're kind of potted and there's going to be no shorts that I have to worry about. So the upper part of the chest is going to have to actually get threaded through because it kind of wraps down into that hip joint there. And I'm doing this while the epoxy is still wet, so any of that potentially will give me a little bit of extra glue hold. I'm going to go ahead and poke this with a little bit of the Tamiya Extra Thin Fast Curing Cement. Still love the Tamiya Extra Thin just because you can hold parts together and let capillary action pull the glue in, and it just creates such a great bond. Then we just need to thread this leg on, which is kind of difficult, but wasn't too bad. This wire is a bit thicker and stiffer than the other wire we had to work with earlier. And then once that's on, it's the easy leg that has no wires to go on. So now how do we hide those magnets that are on top? Well, I'm going to use this little piece of cast cork that I have, little link to the video on how to do this here. And I'm just going to drill a hole to put the wires through. And then I'm actually, oddly enough, I've put the wires through the top of this base. So I'm going to have to drill a hole there, and I'm going to deal with these wires on the bottom side of the base and solder them all together. And once we have all the holes drilled, I just have to twist these wires together and solder them. Now, I'm actually going to put a resistor on the bottom for both of the LEDs, as in one resistor to add some resistance to both the LEDs. Each LED has its own individual resistor, and it really doesn't need this resistor, but this will make the LEDs last a little bit longer, and you definitely don't want to run two LEDs off one resistor in parallel. If you're doing them in series, that's fine, but in parallel, it's not the greatest idea. So it's just a matter of stripping the wire and soldering them together. Now you want to make sure that you have your positive and negative leads picked out in color or some other way to make sure that the LEDs light up, because LEDs are directional. You cannot run them backwards with the current. They have to go one way. They are diodes. And that brings us to this stage. Glowy and beautiful. Now we just need some paint. And here he is, all painted up and ready for the table. The cool thing about having the battery just being held in place by magnets is I don't need a switch. I can just flip this thing upside down and then both contacts are on positive and all the lights turn off. Well, now I have this guy done if I ever actually want to play Canis Rex. I definitely have a really cool new way to do batteries for these smaller bases that I'm really liking. I'd like to thank my Patreons, Axel, FNS Hobbies, and Dominic. If you want to become a Patreon member or just want a cool shirt, there are links in the description. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and thanks for watching.